Since 2014, we've been marking the centenary of the First World War, one of the biggest and most destructive wars in history. In Britain today, it's primarily remembered for the appalling loss of life, and the images of the blood and the stalemate have endured. But the First World War is actually so much bigger than that. There are so many untold stories, and now with the support of the Arts and Humanities Research Council, I've been able to travel right across the country and meet researchers who are telling those untold stories, particularly stories not of the fighting front, but of the home front. Helen Brooks is one of those who's been looking at a different side of the war. She's researching the plays written in Britain during the First World War, and she's working with local volunteers to bring those plays back to life. So how many plays have you catalogued from 14 to 18?
So we've catalogued just under 3,000 plays, and that covers August 1914 to December 1918. And out of those, we've got detailed information on just about 700 of them, which were specifically about the war. And I've been working with over 200 volunteers from across the whole of the country and some international volunteers as well. And they have been researching, finding out who the authors were, and thinking about how they reflect the war. So how are these plays giving us a new insight into what people's attitudes towards the war were at the time, and the different attitudes towards things like the Germans and stuff that's going on around on the home front and on the fighting fronts as well.
So talk to me about some examples you've picked out.
Okay, so the first one that I've picked out is a piece called In the Hands of the Hun. What I love about this particular play is the way that the Germans are represented. So in spy melodramas and in war melodramas, the Germans, of course, are the villains, and they're very stereotypical villains. So they're the sort of almost pantomime-esque in the way that they're represented, with very comedy accents, twirling moustaches, and very much picking up on a lot of the propaganda that was being circulated at the time, particularly after the stories of the rape of Belgium. And we see that in this play. So Otto is our villain here. And Otto, this is from Act 4 of the play, where he is returned to a convent, and at this point he's just after money. He wants to take all the gold and the jewels and anything of value from the convent.
This is so good. You read the Mother Superior, I'll read Otto.
Okay, fantastic. So the Mother Superior is standing in front of the altar, and she says, "Touch them at your peril. This is God's altar, given in sacred trust to me. Each and every one is used in holy sacrament. Dare to lay your sacrilegious hands upon them and you will be accursed."
Stand aside.
My place is here.
Stand aside, or your blood be on your own head.
I will not.
Then curse you. Have it.
And he shoots.
He shoots.
And what you can see here is a big blue line that's been put across this scene. And what that means is that the examiner of plays did not feel that this could be staged. So this had to be cut from the staged play.
So this was too hardcore anti-German for the British authorities in 1915.
Absolutely,
wow.
Yeah.
But that's taste and decency rather than anti-German.
Yes, it is, right? Absolutely. This play is called The Hem of the Flag, and this is actually, as you can see, it was intended for performance on the 14th of September 1914. So this is really, really early in the war. And when we found this one in the British Library manuscripts collection, I was really surprised by it. And I'll read you the licenser's notes, because I think it summarises really well what this play is about. So Ernest Bendel says, "This is a topical monologue spoken by a weary woman worker at a military outfitter's where she's been hemming a Union Jack. The moral of her spirited sermon is that when the honours of final triumph come for the men who fight, there should be some for the women who stop at home for the hemming of the flag." My boy's been called off to help with that little bit of trouble. Not ain't been married so very long neither. I don't think I grudge him, but, well, I don't know where he is, you see. I haven't heard since he left. Well, he's Navy, you see, and with these here mines knocking about, well, I've still got my son, if it is the worst.
First of all, it's a monologue virtually.
Yep, it is.
about the women, and it's so early in the war. This is quite progressive.
It is, yes, I think it is. And it's written by a man, so it's written by Kenelm Foss, who goes on to work in cinema in the 1920s.
And would he have whipped this out since war was declared in early August? Is this
I think so, yes.
Really? They just sat down and bashed out these plays?
Absolutely, and I think that's what a lot of the volunteers on the project have commented, because sometimes when we look at the material, it's very easy to say, oh, this seems rather didactic, or, it's very simplistic in some senses. But actually, you've got to remember that it was churned out really, really quickly. And it was also often reliant on the fact that you would have a company of actors who would be very good at picking up a script and making something more of it.
Okay.
So they're not written to be read. They're not written as literary pieces of art. They're written as a skeleton.
What's the next play?
Okie dokie. So the next play is a play called Tommy by the Way by Captain Oliphant Down. And Down was he actually trained as an accountant, but by about 1910, he's working as a playwright. Tommy, by the Way, is actually written when he's out in France serving. And it's a particularly striking piece because it's seen as depicting shell shock, which is one of those things that isn't often seen on the stage. And a couple of other plays that attempt to depict it do get banned and don't get seen until the mid-1920s. But he sends Tommy by the Way in, and it's a piece which shows a young man walking away from the front line and attempting to give himself a blighty wound so that he can come back home.
Why not? I will. It's easy.
So as he's standing and about to give himself, he's fiddling with his bayonet and trying to stab himself in the arm. This woman appears, and this woman, then it turns out, is the spirit of the women of England.
Who are you?
I am the spirit of the women of England.
The spirit
of the women of England. I was when England first was, and now down through all the historied years.
It's a piece that when you read it seems a little bit over-patriotic, but when it's staged you realise actually that it's both about speaking to the men at the front, particularly when it's written by a soldier who is serving at the front, by an officer at the front, is about actually looking at the way in which there's actually this whole body of the nation behind the men out there where they feel alone and at their weakest. And it's particularly interesting because it's a play which shows a British soldier as vulnerable, which you don't see very often. In the melodramas, they're heroic characters who are, almost swashbuckling types who are defeating whole swathes of Germans. And other than that, we see them as comic characters often, but to actually see a soldier as vulnerable and cowardly in this way is really, really rare. I wonder if it gets past the censor partly because of the fact that it's actually written by a serving officer as well. But it's also a play where there are a number of lines in it which really speak to the realities of living in the trenches, and where he talks about his best mate who's been killed, and he talks about the horrors of the machinery of war, and that this is not the kind of war that he was necessarily expecting or that people at home were aware of.
That's all very well, but they don't know what war is. There ain't no chance for a man at all. It's all machinery and shrapnel and high explosive.
The play ends with him having been, of course, brought to his senses and going back for the big push, which is about to happen. Now, when this play is first staged in January 1917, Oliphant Down is at the front. When it gets restaged in June 1918, he's actually died. So he dies in action on the 23rd of May 1917, hit by enemy fire, and he survives about one day and then dies. And so when the play is restaged, it's in a lot of the advertisements around it, the audiences are told that this is by the late Captain Oliphant Down. And there's a real sense of, in the final words of the play, the fact that this soldier, Oliphant himself perhaps, is turning around and going back for the big push.
In which he dies. So it becomes very poignant.
Captain Down was one of an estimated 750,000 British soldiers who died in the war. But many more were injured and returned to Britain for treatment. So great was the need that some large homes were converted into hospitals. Nicola Gould has been researching these places, such as this grand house on the outskirts of Birmingham.
The Highbury, for example, belonged to Joseph Chamberlain. After he died, it was gifted by his family to the city to become an auxiliary hospital for the treatment of soldiers.
This is a pretty good place to recover.
Yes, it's beautiful, and we'll see in a minute. The inside, it's a beautiful home. So yes, I'm sure that would have played a part in their recuperation.
And have the insides changed much?
Not too much, so we can have a look at some photographs and then match them up to the building now.
Good. Grand entrance hall.
Yes.
Do we know what this space would have been used for?
So yes, we have an image here this is just a print from the archives, and it shows that this would have been the dining space.
Yeah. And do we know how many people might have been recuperating here at any one time?
It was over 200, I think. Yeah, I think at one point, I think that was the highest. It was about 220 or something. But I think it just gives you a sense of what had to, the kind of necessity of it. There were so many casualties coming back to big cities like Birmingham, that it did take private homes to be turned over to auxiliary hospitals because of the sheer numbers.
It's when you see things like this and you realise that expression, total war,
Yes,
it was the whole economic output, young human output, and then all of these big buildings just being used to try and patch the young men up again.
Yeah, definitely, and obviously touching everybody's lives. So people that were living, in the south of Birmingham, coming into contact with, soldiers that had come back with horrific injuries.
So what other kinds of treatment would they be having here?
So Highbury specialised in orthopaedic surgery, but they also were using maybe slightly more experimental therapies such as massage and electrotherapy for men. I think it's probably men that had shell shock, so they had muscle tremors. There was also things like curative treatment, so they could, if they didn't already have a trade, they could learn things like shoemaking, tailoring, and kind of electrical work as well. So there was a lot of that, I think, either as therapy, but also probably to prepare them for when the war ended and they had to go back to work.
So this is Joseph Chamberlain's library?
Yeah, so this is a library. So we have one archive photograph that is certainly taken in here. So this shows massage that was happening in the library.
It looks like all the bookshelves have been taken
Yes,
down.
all the bookcases have been taken out. So this is probably the wall here.
And that used to be a window, maybe.
And that was a window, yeah. But you can see, it's quite crammed, actually.
Really crammed,
in terms of the numbers of soldiers that are being treated here. But quite interesting, to have this massage therapy. People probably don't associate that with the First World War.
At the Library of Birmingham, Nicola showed me some more photographs of Highbury that she's uncovered.
It looks like because you've got all sorts of different therapeutic activities,
Yes.
It looks like quite a progressive regime they had there.
I think it was. And there were, I think, around 200 soldiers there. So quite a large number, but it looks... it's hard to tell from these images because they are, some of them, very set up. They are showing what was happening, but certainly there were different types of activities that the men could get involved in, different types of therapies as well.
I love the gymnasium. Look at this
Yeah,
exercise
fantastic.
bike.
Yeah.
Turning the big steering wheel on the wall.
Yeah.
And then just a reminder of the number of women that would have been involved in the war effort back here in the Homefront.
Yeah, and the woman in the
numbers as well.
centre, you can see they're quite formidable looking. This is Amy Porter. She was the commandant of Highbury. Very important in terms of running it. I think was extremely efficient in terms of running the hospital. But quite sadly, her son, she had one son, and he was killed in 1916. So she, like many other women, suffered a personal loss.
You just can't help looking at the faces, thinking, what were their injuries, what were they going through?
This one's lovely actually, because it is a little bit more informal. They're outside. They've all got walking sticks, so they've obviously had quite sort of serious injuries. But there is something quite nice about that image, I think.
I wonder if they were being prepared for civilian life, or whether it was hoped that some of these men would go back to the trenches. Yeah,
I think probably a combination actually. You can see there that they are learning things like tailoring, different types of electrical works, cobbling as well.
What else have we got?
So on the other side here, we've got a collection of photographs that all relate to the University of Birmingham, which was it became the first Southern General Hospital. So they had made plans from around 1908 that should, in the event of the outbreak of war, the newly opened university could be quickly transformed into a hospital. So when the war started, within weeks, they had injured soldiers coming to be treated. You can see in this particular image, this is the Great Hall in the Aston Webb building, which is full of beds there.
You really get a sense from all of these that every inch of space was taken up, whether it's
Yeah.
physics lab, the Great Hall, even gardens.
Definitely.
I
And
mean,
the
they're
numbers.
packed in numbers.
Yeah, the numbers were huge. It was hundreds and hundreds of soldiers were being treated there. So these are autograph books that were kept by soldiers, or also just by people that were living in Birmingham at the time. So you can see here quite a nice drawing. I can't love a fella what hasn't died for his country. A lot of them are propaganda. You know, they're used to
They're sort of memes, aren't
criticise.
they?
Or,
They're
yeah,
kind of, so that would be similar to a recruiting poster
definitely.
that they,
Yes.
and,
yeah.
and you draw this in a mate's autograph book with you as a
Yeah,
sort
I
of
think
keepsake.
so.
And,
Yeah, it's a keepsake, definitely.
Like signing the old Leavers
Yes.
yearbook when you
Yeah,
leave, high
definitely.
school,
Yeah, and just I guess, you know, if you're meeting different people, you know, if you're a soldier serving, you might
Yeah.
meet different people. It's, you know, a way of sort of saving something. This one's lovely though.
Yeah, really interesting.
So we've got, as you can see, an injured soldier wearing the blue uniform, and the caption says, "He looked smarter in khaki, but I love him best in this."
Mm.
So it's quite sweet in a way. I mean, it's very sort of childlike, you know, in both of them. They're depicted as children. But it's quite poignant because he's clearly back
Badly
in this
wounded.
country. He's badly
Yeah.
wounded, but he's back and he's with his sweetheart.
Yeah.
You know, he's not gone back to the front.
It's funny how the role of women in both of those, role of girlfriends and lovers,
Yeah.
was really important to these
Yeah.
young men. Whether or not it was about them serving and women, you know, whether they were more or less likely, if you like, to succeed romantically.
Yeah, definitely. But there's something I think really quite
Very
touching
mo-
about
yeah,
this. It
very
reveals
so.
quite a lot, doesn't it, about the war, even though it's a very simple
Yeah.
cartoon. So we've got all this fantastic material here that relates to Birmingham, but of course it was a similar picture in Germany
Yeah.
as well. So one of the research projects that we worked on last year was a photography project based around the work by Kathe Buchler,
Who's a German photographer.
who's a German
yeah.
photographer, based in the town of Braunschweig. Braunschweig was a bit like Birmingham in that it was a hospital city, and so she went to the hospital in the first couple of years and documented some of the patients there.
There's a shocking symmetry or mirror image.
Yeah,
There's
definitely.
young men
Cobblers.
cobbling.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
Christmas, we saw Christmas
Yep.
decoration celebrations, just mirror images of each other.
Yeah,
young
absolutely.
men.
Yeah, and I mean this one is certainly one.
Shocking.
Yeah, this image, you know, when we first started working on this project, this is the image I think that would sum up the whole of her work for me. She's very artistic. You can see in her images. She's documenting, but they're much more artistic. I think much more sensitive than some of the ones we've looked at from Birmingham. But this image in particular, we know nothing about this soldier, but we can see this horrendous arm injury that he's suffered. And I just think that, you know, the way she composes the image, the lighting, the fact that she shoots it, you know, we don't see his face, is extremely poignant and moving. And again, you know, we have all these questions. What happened to him? What happened? How did he receive that injury? What was his story? What happened when he came back?
You can't look at any of these pictures without thinking, I'd love to know who they
Yeah,
are, whether
definitely.
they made it, whether they rehabilitated
Yeah.
successfully.
Kathe Buchler's extraordinary photographs have only recently become better known. The University of Hertfordshire recently exhibited some of her photographs showing life on the German Homefront. Researcher Rachel Duffet showed me some of the highlights.
So what makes this set of photographs so remarkable?
Well, I think it's remarkable on several counts. Taken by a woman at a time when women weren't actively involved in photography in the way that they are now. And also for us sitting here in Britain, it's a revelation as to life on the German Homefront, which is not something we know a huge amount about, I don't think.
I don't know why we should be surprised, but it turns out the enemy don't look so very different to us, do they? It's sort of very poignant.
It does prove, doesn't it, the universality of society and both, as you say, both sides of the wall looking pretty much identical. I mean, the Imperial War Museum has a whole set of photographs of women doing men's jobs, and you could almost interpose them. They would not look very different.
And she is on the streets. I mean, literally, this is a
Yes.
real. You get a sense the cobbles, the outfit. This is a
Yes.
coal heaver, is it?
Yeah, the dust or...
I mean,
yeah.
this is the proper images of society from the bottom up.
Yes, it is. And, you know, strong women, this isn't, you know, these are not easy jobs. This is manual labour. Several of them are showing women labouring. You know.
But she looks quite happy, doesn't she?
Yeah, and why would she not? She's probably earning more money than she would earn as a housemaid or a cook in a domestic service. Probably, you know, even some of the lower paid factory jobs or shop jobs didn't pay as well as labouring work did. And she's doing her bit for the nation. You know, German women felt as British women did, that, you know, God was with them, and they wanted to do their bit to support the soldiers fighting on the front.
And there's something about their uniforms, isn't it? It's really
Yes.
striking.
I think it's really important, isn't it? You know, when you put your uniform on, you become part of something, don't you? And whether it's a train or a bus conductor or a postwoman, you know, you're not just you're a part of a state that has
you're
a
an
mission.
agent of the state. And you have authority.
Yes.
Oh, and you have authority over men, don't you? Because as a male passenger, I'd be like, okay, sorry.
Well, we don't have any traffic wardens here, obviously, a little bit before that time. But yeah, it's about power, isn't it? And that's something that for certainly working class women was not part of their day-to-day life outside of their family environment.
This would have been one of the most regular sites delivering, and of course tragic in some ways because people would be delivering news, good and bad, from the front.
Yes, and you know, people behind those doors, no doubt waiting, bated breath.
These guys look very happy, don't they?
Women wearing trousers. This is very exciting at this period, and it frees women up in a way, you know, physically frees them up in a way that long skirts, you know, inhibited them and their movement. And
presumably they have more, it frees them up literally to move and be in different parts of town and not just run errands for their boss.
Well, and to walk freely, you know, because you're not hobbled by the long, narrow skirts of the early 20th century. You know, you're not all roughed and laced up, which even working class women would be. You know, you are kind of liberated, I think, by your dress as well as by the situation in which you find yourself.
And I mean, as for this greatcoat, I mean, I would do whatever she told. Well, yeah, but there's nothing that says authority like a big old greatcoat with shiny buttons.
That's true. And you know, and these are, you know, is First World War, dreadful as it is, it does provide these opportunities for women that had not existed for them before. So, you know, and in fact, some people, D.H. Lawrence, for example, in Britain, writes dreadful poems, anti-women poems. Sassoon talks about, you know, women walking across dead men's graves, you know, sitting at home. You know, it's seen as an opportunity for women in a way, while the men are off dying.
And when the war finished, both in Britain and in Germany, to what extent were these women, did they leave these jobs voluntarily, and what extent were they forced out?
You know, you'd have to ask. I mean, you have to ask them to a degree, because some women wanted to go back home and they wanted to return to domesticity. They wanted to repopulate the, you know, nation by building relationships with men and families. But of course, there must have been a huge number of women who didn't, who wanted to continue with their relatively well-paid, relatively liberated roles. But that wasn't going to be possible with soldiers coming back from the front. So they were effectively forced out of the workplace. Back into the home to have more children, or to the home to provide domestic service, as, you know, traditionally their role had been.
What do you think was the legacy of all these women in these pictures, both in Germany and the UK? The big steps forward in terms of female emancipation at the end of the 20th century, this has to have made a difference.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, in Britain, certainly having, you know, the movement before the war, which is all suspended during the war, the suffragettes, but those memories are there. And some could argue that Britain was about to give women the vote anyway, and it was war that delayed it. But war gives women the chance to prove their citizenship, to show that they are as deserving of the vote as any man. Because I mean, why should a fit woman who's labouring away for the war effort, why should she not be able to vote when a very old disabled man sits at home with a vote? You know, it's those kinds of anomalies that make people think that women had the power, should have the power to become involved.
And it's a wonderful set of photographs because it captures our generation of women who are working alongside pioneers in Parliament and suffragists. Actually, these women were equally important, really, in the freedoms that we all enjoy today.
Yes.
My final stop is Northern Ireland, the Ballykinler Army Camp. Here, archaeologists have found something extraordinary. Century-old trenches, created to train soldiers before they were sent to the Western Front. In charge of the excavation is Heather Montgomery.
Hi Heather.
Hiya.
Good to see you.
Welcome, welcome.
Thank you very much. Not a bad day for it, eh?
Well, you're lucky. This is the area that we have recently had scheduled, protected. This incorporates the best example of the remaining First World War landscape that's here.
These are First World War practice trenches, are they?
Yeah. They're not full scale. I've basically sort of termed this as an outdoor classroom. There's evidence to suggest that it was purely a dry training area, but there is also, like, no, we didn't get any live. No, we didn't get any live ammunition out of it.
Oh, look, this is clearly.
But
you can tell these
yeah,
L shapes here. That's not natural, is
no,
it?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
It's very moving to see First World War trenches in the UK. It sort of is. It's a surprise, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the story that the Irish didn't really train much to head off to war has sort of been counteracted on the basis that we now know that this here was something that was very common across the whole of the island of Ireland at the time. It's not just in Ballykinler.
But despite the First World War's reputation, the learning was coming back from the battlefield, and that was changing the training all the time. Trenches were training. So yeah, techniques would have been changing all the time here.
Notes from the front coming back to the officers and fed down through the regiments, battalions, and eventually put out into the classroom in the field and put into practice and used in that manner.
You're not just teaching people how to fight the Germans here, you're actually presumably teaching them how to live and work in this very unusual situation. I mean, no one would have been prepared for this before the war, were they?
You're telling all those aspects of it and trying to arm basically these young men and their commanders with the best tools possible to go out and do what they had to do.
Using aerial surveys and LiDAR technology, Heather has been able to map a complex network of trenches dug over several years.
This here had 3 phases. So you have your original front line, which then progressed into a more sort of complex phase of trench systems, which then eventually, as the war progressed, the realisation that machine gun was actually top dog, really. So they started employing the machine gun and the training off. So this here then was evolved into a training position for machine gun fire.
I guess you could never replicate the Western Front battlefield, but this is evidence of a lot of effort went into trying to make it as realistic as possible. Yeah,
it's proof of the investment in Ireland, and it's proof of the investment of sort of realising that the information that was coming back from the Western Front at the time was of importance. They started putting into practice their education basically in this outdoor classroom, what they'd learned here, taking what they'd learned here and adapting it in the front, and obviously trying to preserve their lives, I suppose.
Ballykinler is still a working army base. So what does one of today's soldiers make of these discoveries?
It's interesting because not a great deal's changed from what the commanders were trying to teach their troops to do then, in how to live in the field, how to, you try living in that for 5-10 days in the pouring rain, and we all know what the Western Front was like. That takes a skill, otherwise you don't survive. So they get a procedural way of living. Nowhere near the same as sitting on the front line with artillery going over the top of you and flares going up in the night and that sort of stuff, but it's a process. That process is no different to what we do today. We have processes and we teach our guys through the low-level training up to the sort of advanced training how to do things, whether it be a relief in place, whether that be how to put a bridgehead in, or whatever we have that process. So it's teaching how to do it in, if you like, a peacetime environment where they're not having rounds coming into them. So they get the procedure right, the chain of command understands the procedure, the lowly soldier understands the procedure, and hopefully if something goes wrong within the command structure, it can still take place because mission command is taking place at that stage.
When you look back at this generation, do you feel you've got more in common with these guys, you owe more to these guys than you do, say, the Boer War generation, the Crimean War? Just feels suddenly like it's a recognisable kind of soldiering.
What we've learnt probably is that we're all the same, and I can imagine a 16, 17, 18-year-old lad from Belfast in there in 1914 with the same fears and worries, wanting to know where his mum is, to a guy going off to Afghan 4 or 5 years ago who would have been based here in Ballykinler. Same sort of worries.
It's impossible not to be fascinated by the First World War, and it's been such a privilege for me on this project, travelling the country, learning about the untold stories of World War I. Now, thanks to the support, given by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, I've been able to meet professionals and volunteers who've been, in some cases quite literally, unearthing new stories about that conflict, even though it's now 100 years old. And what these people have explained to me, and what these new projects have taught me, is that the First World War wasn't just a story of gigantic battles and terrible losses on foreign fields, but of a national endeavour, something that touched the lives of everybody right here in the UK.